Dr. Bartholomew Higgins was not one of those men who went to medical school in the hopes of taking home a fat paycheck or developing the unbridled prestige of Hippocrates' profession. No, he was of that sort that really cared. And not that sort that cared in the beginning but got bogged down in bills and stress until he or she snapped and went about the rest of their work with the cynicism of those who only wanted the former, but the sort that cared from beginning to end. Rather than go into some massive, famous hospital with important work to do, but plenty of other capable doctors willing to do it, Bartholomew chose to take a massive pay cut and open a practice in a small, underserved town in the middle of nowhere. Boy, did that town welcome him. Not only was his medical expertise necessary, it was affordable. While Higgins had enough of a sense of self-preservation not to work for free, he often let the impoverished gather debts from him that went uncollected. From those who could afford it, he tried to make sure they paid on time, but his naturally kind nature made it somewhat of a challenge. Luckily, he had the goodwill of the town on his side, and even those who struggled to pay for his services did everything they could to get every cent they owed him. Ever since he had saved Farmer John's son from appendicitis at only a quarter of the procedure's normal cost, he had never wanted for food, unless it was something John couldn't grow, but he wasn't a picky eater. But he still occasionally went hungry when he found out a neighbor was struggling to pay their bills and decided that John should pay off his debt by helping them instead. Dr. Higgins had a kindly and reassuring smile, one that he used when he talked to scared children getting their shots for the first time, and for older families who were embarrassed when they decided to pay the full price regardless of his requests and still came up short. It was hard to find anything critical to say about him. Some thought he could laugh more, but his laughter was only shrunken by his refusal to engage in humor that relied on cruelty, unless he thought even the one at the butt of his jokes would get a kick out of it. Others were unnerved by his reaction to the patients who he couldn't save, or rather his lack of reaction. One would expect this kind of man to be devastated to hear of others' misfortunes, and he normally was, but when a man, woman, or child he was trying to save died under his care, whatever sorrow he expressed seemed only to exist for the family's benefit. Most dismissed this as a coping mechanism, allowing him to stay sane in the face of death, and praised him for it. Of course, no one in this world gets to take a dip in the cauldron of character traits without picking up a few distinct flaws. In Dr. Higgins' case, however, he only seemed to pick up one. You see, dear reader, in certain circumstances, well, I will give you an instant where this flaw revealed itself. The Partridge family's son had broken his arm in a rather nasty car accident. They were terrified of what could happen if he were not treated immediately. Dr. Higgins went to work in an instant, using every diagnostic technique that seemed appropriate. The child is in critical condition. Cracked bone is infecting his blood. I'm going to have to operate. When he was alone, he told the Partridge boy that surgery would be required, which required going under, which required getting a shot. The Partridge boy informed Bartholomew that he understood, which prompted the good doctor to get everything ready. First, he would destroy the x-rays that revealed the boy's arm to be suffering from a regular fracture that a routine bone setting and cast would fix up. Then he would prepare the syringe of the deadly neurotoxin. Then he would inject the boy for his favorite part of the whole ordeal. For whatever reason, he loved to watch children die. There was a certain pleasantness to it, the way they fell asleep and their hearts stopped, not even knowing what he had done to them, never knowing what he had done to them. No one ever knew. The local records keeper would trust him on the COD because he had no reason not to, and none of the other locals had even half the knowledge to comprehend the difference between what Bartholomew told them was wrong for children and the truth. Now, as I said, this was his only notable character flaw. Bartholomew Higgins was not a torturer, nor a molester, nor a murderer. Just a murderer. The kids never suffered in their deaths. In fact, they just perceived it as going to sleep. One might think he would get tired of the repetitiveness, if nothing else, but the Partridge boy was his 43rd, and the sight of him taking his final breath filled him with the same fascination as the first. Anyway, he told the Partridge family that he did everything he could, but that the boy didn't make it. He held them in their sorrow, He waived them of all bills for the materials used and sent them on their way to people he felt could better comfort them in this time of need. That is his only noteworthy flaw, as far as the author can tell, but this is the story of the good Dr. Bartholomew, so let's not focus on his flaws for longer than we have to. Anyway, whenever his perhaps too kind business practices would allow it, he tried to use his money to aid the poor. The reader already heard about some of these endeavors, but maybe he or she will be interested to hear about the various charitable organizations he was both part of and, in a few cases, founded. Literacy training for adults who had never learned to read, free daycare so unplanned mothers could stay in school or work with minds at ease, former lawyers who could help veterans and adopted children and victims of legal fraud tear through the layers of bureaucracy that held them back, free recreations and books for children from low-income families, funding for school counselors, the list goes on and on. While he rarely felt himself informed enough to get involved in politics, he did go to town hall meetings, where he often found himself the de facto voice of reasoning, reminding people that they were talking with their neighbors and keeping debates reasonably civil. By his 10th year as a local doctor, there wasn't a person in the entire town who didn't have some story about the overwhelming kindness of the good Dr. Bartholomew. Philip Strikes, the funeral home director, was no exception to that rule. Higgins had fixed his knee a few years back for a fair price. Still, Strikes was not fond of the doctor. It wouldn't be unfair to say there are people in the world who hate others for no particular reason, and that could be the case between these two, but Strikes didn't believe it. One could still make the case that Strikes just didn't want to consider himself among that group, but no, Strikes had a conceptual understanding of his hatred for the doctor. He just didn't have one that fit into comprehensible words. Higgins was constantly asking him to lower his prices, particularly when it was for someone who had died under his care, but a lot of people asked for that, and Higgins was more polite about it than most. Actually, maybe that was why Strikes wasn't fond of Higgins. The good Dr. Bartholomew was always so polite, even when politeness was not called for. Call it a justification for an old man's bitterness, but Strikes felt there were situations where you had to be mean, where being kind was more cruel than spitting in someone's face. Cruelty got things done. Now that we've settled that, we've come to an unfortunate part of our tale. Strikes was an old man, old enough to remember the last two town doctors. As someone who had an unfair advantage in determining the town's death patterns, he noticed that Higgins lost less men and women than the last ones. Good. He had some competence along with that kindness. Strangely enough, though, that competence didn't seem to extend to children. In fact, more of them seemed to die with Higgins than with any others. Someone more familiar with the medical system, or even who had a greater love for the doctor than Philip, would have passed this off as an unfortunate flaw in his training. It was no secret that some doctors were better with certain age groups than with others, but perhaps because of Strikes' general disdain, he felt there was something wrong. Acting so as not to raise questions from the townsfolk, he managed to get a scientist from out of town to look at the corpses of some of these children. Although the scientist in question was disgruntled by this waste of time, especially after the first child examined turned out to have died in exactly the way Higgins described, he soon became interested in the recurring neurotoxin that simultaneously appeared in the vast majority of dead children and did not appear in any of Bartholomew Higgins' records. I'll spare you the excessive details. Higgins was caught, the town defended him as everyone refused to believe it, the evidence became insurmountable, he eventually admitted to it, the town was sent to shock, Strikes was briefly hailed as a hero, and the charitable organizations he was part of were forced to undergo humiliating investigations. Some of them that he founded disbanded out of disgust, even though there was nothing particularly wrong with their services. It's a little amazing, isn't it, how one detail about a person can change everything about their legacy. Dr. Bartholomew Higgins ultimately killed 87 children before he was exposed, but that was far less than he saved from life-threatening problems when he wasn't in the mood, and who knows how many he saved from themselves through his youth programs. A new doctor showed up, this one expecting full payment at almost all times from every person. Most of the informal deals, such as between John and the starving neighbors, broke apart or became less bountiful in their offerings. Town halls got vicious. The charity programs that hadn't been disbanded found themselves with ill repute and often underfunded. In general, it felt as if something was missing from the municipality. Thanks to Higgins, the town had been growing in community. Now it was just a community in name. All of it stopped because of 87 children and one good doctor's one little flaw.